Welcome back to Financial Therapy. Before we get into this episode, I want to provide a quick warning. We'll be discussing issues of abuse that may be triggering to some people. Please refer to the show notes of this episode for a list of domestic violence hotlines in your country. Let me ask you this. Have you or someone you know had their intimate partner force you to purchase things that you didn't want or need? What about them controlling where you spend your money and requiring you to account for everything you spent in your day? Or has that partner maxed out your credit cards and then doesn't make payment on the balance? Maybe they've prevented you from working, or they have limited your ability to attend a job, training, pursue higher education, or otherwise advance your career. Or simply, they spent your money without your knowledge. What I've just listed are some of the signs of what could be a financially abusive relationship. And you know what? Financial abuse is more common than you think, and it can happen to anyone at any time of their lives. But you might be interested to know that financial abuse is common in young people's relationships. Even with all that we know about abuse in intimate relationships, the benefit of education and opportunity, but it's still a big problem. We're speaking with Dr. Jessica Cooten, a senior researcher at RMIT University and the Law Foundation, who turned her deep fascination about why this is happening to young people to lead a team at the university to develop a toolkit for young adults about money and love.
Fascinated is the right word. I was actually kind of shocked to find examples of financial abuse in young adult relationships. So I'm looking at 18 to 29-year-olds.
If you're loving the show, please rate and review. Plus, if you want to support my work in giving financial literacy and financial capability training to at-risk homeless, you can make a donation at financialtherapy.org, or you can buy my book, The Billionaire Buddha. Thank you, Jessica, for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jane. I'm very excited.
Before we start, I'd just like to always find out a little bit about what you do. So can you just tell us what your training is and your work is?
So I've got a background in forensic psychology, actually, but I've worked in a whole variety of places, such as drug and alcohol centres, prisons, and I've also worked as a researcher overseas. But most of the time I've worked as a researcher, looking at kind of, I suppose, what you'd call these wicked problems, drug and alcohol, crime, and now most recently looking at financial capabilities and financial abuse. So I started working at RMIT as a researcher, and then I completed my PhD there, where I investigated financial abuse in young adult relationships specifically.
Financial abuse is a word that some people may not have heard before, and that another term is economic abuse. Are they the same or interchangeable, or what is financial abuse?
So it depends on probably what area you work in, what country you're from, and what your research field is. People do use them interchangeably. I think more commonly, especially when I was talking about the area, I would say economic abuse. And then people would think, oh, is that when a small country gets exploited by a bigger country? And it's kind of, oh, no, okay, it's financial abuse. But what's, I guess, the distinction between the two is that financial abuse is more so focused on the money side of things, whereas economic abuse includes the money side of things, but also your potential to be an economically thriving person. So your capacity to be able to learn or get a job or those kinds of things. So they're things that are related to money, but aren't the money part of things per se.
Yeah, okay. And I know in your research you've been focusing on the demographic around 18 to 29. What is it that fascinated you about that cohort rather than, say, economic abuse in other age brackets?
I think fascinated is the right word. I was actually kind of shocked to find, examples of financial abuse in young adult relationships. So I'm looking at 18 to 29-year-olds, right? And I guess for me, I really wanted to focus on prevention. So how can we stop this from happening? And I think that age range is the time when you're becoming more financially, socially, and everything else independent from your parents. When you're 18, you can make your own decisions about things. You also have access to credit and other financial products. You're also able to earn more money, but it's also that critical phase in your life where people are developing relationships and, potentially embarking on their future longer term types of relationships. So it's really that developmental phase where you're kind of experimenting with those different parts of life. What are you going to do for work? What are you going to do for study? Where you're going to live, who you're going to live with, who you're going to possibly marry or spend most of the rest of your life with, perhaps. And so I'd seen the issue crop up in, obviously, the older generation, like my parents, migrants, coming from typically patriarchal type societies. And then amongst, my generation of friends, it also popped up as well. And I went like, hang on, didn't we have the benefit of, access to education and all these kinds of things and being able to, we could do whatever we wanted, we could have children and work and all these kinds of things at the same time. So that kind of shocked me. But then what shocked me even more was listening to, I guess, the daughters of my friends, so young adults, 18, 20, 22, being exploited by their boyfriends. And I just thought, what is going on here? I thought that they would have maximal benefit from, gender equality, the kind of information and campaigns about gender equality, respectful relationships and those kinds of things, yet it was still happening. So I found that a real puzzle. I was actually shocked to find out that it was still going on or happening for young people. I thought we'd moved on from that. I thought that was something to do with the 50s,
Yeah. So that's interesting. You're saying that, say, my friends' daughters were being abused by their boyfriends. Is it something is gender a thing when it comes to younger financial abuse?
Gender is a thing, or gender is an issue throughout, right? Through all age groups and cohorts. And in particular, in terms of financial and economic abuse, through partners, through your intimate partner. And we know that the prevalence is much greater. Women are much like other forms of
abuse,
domestic or family violence. Yeah, women are more likely to be victims, and that is the same for economic abuse. They are more likely, twice as likely at least, to be victims of financial abuse. The gender issue starts to shift a little bit when you're looking at elder abuse, and that is also where it can be, for example, your adult children or somebody else exploiting you or abusing your financial situation when you're older, and the victims can be male or female. The gender issue is a bit less there.
But something in the intimate relationship dynamic.
Yes, and that whole influence of, I guess, gender stereotypes or gender norms, where there is this expectation that, men are better at managing money, men have the right to manage money, and in particular, when someone is the main income earner, that therefore they have more say over what should happen to that money and what the household decisions should be. But we're talking about younger adults who are in their kind of newly formed relationships. I'm not talking about people who've been married for 10, 20 years or something like that, where these patterns might be established. So it is more common amongst women for a variety of those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But there are instances where men are victims as well.
Mm-hmm. So is there, say, factors that determine what may happen in financial abuse relationships?
And so financial abuse, going back to the definition, broadly encompasses three types of tactics. And underneath these three broad areas, there are like other kind of, let's say, sub-behaviours or warning signs that could indicate that this is what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so those three broad areas are like financial control, right, or economic control. And I think that's what we most typically hear about in the media and in stories that are shared, is about when, and it could also be the man, but when the woman has no access to household finances, has no access to, or is not involved in financial decision making, has no access to, bank statements, ATM cards, isn't able to get money out for themselves, don't have access to what the bills might be, get quizzed every time they need to go and, buy things that have to justify every expense. They might be given a paltry allowance that they need to manage the whole household. So it's very controlling.
Yeah.
and it's quite restrictive, and it's often associated with other types of abusive behaviours in that relationship, right? So that's that control kind of, I suppose, typology.
Mm-hmm.
The other form or group of behaviours are those around exploitation. So that's when, someone is being used for their finances. So that's where you might have, people wanting you to lend them money, but they won't pay it back.
Yep.
Wanting for you to be able to use your credit rating, your credit card, or your ability to get a loan or hire purchase, because they are unable to do that to get a product for them, for which you might be, left with the debt.
Yep.
And so that's kind of more in a situation where there is a level of people have their own individual incomes, or they have income, and then one other person is basically using the other person like their credit card or their own personal ATM machine.
Yeah.
And certainly that was more common amongst the young people that I interviewed for my research. So I remember one woman saying, like, I actually just realised at the end of it all, I was just a cash cow, and once I started saying no, he disappeared. He wasn't interested anymore, but in other cases where there was a lot of financial control, so they would, in particular, young women who had children quite young, late teenage years, getting, Centrelink benefits and having all that money taken from them, and then being reliant upon their parents or friends for food and, other things for children, for themselves. So that's that really kind of controlling type of situation. But the other group of tactics, which also can be quite subtle in a way, is when partners interfere in someone's decisions about where they want to work, where they want to study, or actually being able to work or able to study, So there were cases where partners would, deny people access to the internet so they couldn't study, or they would say, no, I don't want you to study that course because it involves dealing with male clients or whatever it might be. I want you to, if you study that course, you have to go and work in aged care because all old people, not young men.
Yeah.
And so, it can be quite subtle like that.
Yeah.
And so, they're those three broad areas where there's the controlling things. And I think that's more common. People associate financial abuse more with that, not having any control over your finances, not having access to your finances. But there is all that exploitation component. And I guess what I find with young people is that it kind of snuck up on them. It's kind of like any abusive situation. Like, generally, if people are really horrible at the start, you're not going to move in with them, one would hope. And these things, are gradual and are subtle, and then build up and build up. And one of the things I think for young people, big risk factors, and this is, occurs with or without abuse, is sliding into cohabitation, what they call officially slide. It's like, we met each other, after about a month, he moved in, and he's been there ever since. And typically when that happens, before they've actually sussed out whether, are we compatible emotionally, but are we compatible financially, everything is laid out on the table because you're living together.
Yeah.
And I kind of called this that they by default became economically entangled with each other, right? Which when the relationship breaks down, can have very dramatic consequences for them financially.
Yeah. So you've covered off a lot of things that I was going to ask you. That day to day, there's that entanglement that happens. And that entanglement sounds very subtle, and you're not really conscious until at some stage big bill comes in, and it's like, what's my name doing on it? And it's really interesting that you're listing out that day to day entanglement that younger people can certainly face.
That's exactly right. And I think people, and it was often the theme that was reiterated was like, oh, look, he lost his job and, he didn't have enough money for next month's rent. So, I paid for that. But because it's like, I love him and he loves me. And if that happened to me, surely he would, or he or she would come to my aid as well, But I think eventually what they found was that wasn't necessarily the case. That was very one-sided, and the trust wasn't there. But yeah, it is that economic entanglement. And so it's kind of like, there was one young woman who said, my boyfriend, he wanted to get a car, but, he couldn't get the credit, so he couldn't get the car finance at the car yard. So I went along with him and just said like, oh, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, do my credit check. So this kind of this lack of awareness of actually the financial consequences of some of these decisions, right?
Mm.
And then she said, yeah, but luckily I didn't pass the credit check either, right? So she was lucky, but it does happen quite often where, and I also interviewed experts in the area who were dealing with young people and untangling this mess, where, you know, that they would drag the girlfriend along to the car yard, doesn't even have a license, but just because the credit check goes through, you know, signs off the loan for the guy, you know, they break up and then she's stuck with this, you know, kind of debt that she needs to pay. But, you know, at that time, it's like, you know, I'm doing this because I love you, or, you know, but there also might be that kind of emotional pressure as well in like, you know, oh, you know, if you really loved me, you'd come and help me out or
You
something
do
like
that.
that. Yeah. And it doesn't need to be explicit. It can be, you know, also implied in there.
Yeah. In an intimate relationship or a committed relationship, there is that community that you are trying to create in a way that I am, if I was in the same situation, you would help me, or if you're in this situation, because in the communal sort of undertaking here that we're doing, that can get very blurred.
Yep,
Is that right?
that's exactly right. And this is where I think the fundamental struggle is that we have in our intimate relationships now, given everything that I said at the beginning, that we're supposed to be free and independent.
Mm.
So, and is this tension between individualism and work operating as a collective.
Yeah.
So, you know, we go to university or get our first job, and as women in particular, we're told, get your own job, save your own money, get your own place, be independent, all this kind of thing. And you're doing all of that. It's all going along great. You get into a relationship and you go like, oh, hang on. Now I've got this other person. How do I negotiate all of these things?
Mm.
So, you know, the ideal is, of course, that we operate as a collective, right?
Yeah.
And for any collective to operate, you need to have trust amongst its members, right?
Yeah.
And there needs to be open communication, and everyone no matter what kind of collective it is, and everyone needs to be able to go, oh, that wasn't quite right. No, we'll fix that up, and there needs to be reparation and all those kinds of things. And also, like, well, I guess what's important about a collective is that they have a future kind of goal, journey, pathway, or a hope that's not just in the mind of one person,
Yeah.
but that everybody agrees and explicitly in a way. And I suppose that's what marriage does, doesn't it? It's saying you're making this future.
Yeah. And it's to the benefit of all parties as well.
That's exactly right. So that's what's really important, is that with those decisions and financial decisions, they're sort of just about me, my desires, and me meeting my needs. It's like, okay, well, how do we negotiate a way in which, you know, that old classic win-win situation,
Yeah.
right? Of course, it benefits me if you do the dishes all the time. Perfect. Of course, I'll be happy with that, you know, but you're not going to be happy with that.
Yeah.
Right. And do I want you to be unhappy? No, I don't. Okay. So we need to find that middle ground. And I think, you know, that's just with a whole lot of things that you have to manage in relationships. So I think we basically get trained to be independent, to be financially independent, right? And to be equal. Like the gender pay gap is at its smallest in that 18 to 29-year-old category, right? You're all still working. You're not encumbered by experiencing the disadvantages of raising children and having career pauses and all those kinds of things. So that's great. But you get into that collective situation. What do? I mean, there's multiple ways that people can manage money in a relationship, right? And in a household. Do you keep everything separate all the time? Do you keep accounts like, oh, you spent that on that, but I'm not using that, so I'm not. You bought the Vegemite. I don't eat Vegemite, so I'm not contributing to that. I mean, you know, it can get like that.
Yeah.
It becomes ridiculous, right? And then the other is that laissez-faire. Oh, we'll just chuck it all together, and yes, we do everything, and everything's great without considering future consequences of that. And so I'm not advocating one way or the other, but there needs to be a balance. But there's also, just like you build trust in a relationship, or love grows, or the emotional connection grows, so does, and your emotional trust grows. But I also see that there needs, your financial trust also needs to grow.
Yeah.
So you just can't assume that even though you might have emotional trust, or you can emotionally trust a person, that you can therefore financially trust them as well.
Yeah. So on that point, is there as we're talking about financial therapy, we're talking a lot about the sort of attachment or socialization. What was the conditioning that was laid down before we even get into the scenario with being with another? In your research, is there issues of people's upbringings maybe making them more susceptible to being in a situation where they may be financially abused, or it can happen to anybody?
It can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
Basically, kind of anyone who can fall in love, it can happen to you, right? So, that initial process of falling in love, limerence, where you're flooded with all those hormones. And it's a really important phase because what all those love hormones do is narrow your focus on that person and narrows your focus on the positive aspects of that person. I can't tell you how many times, with the young people that I interviewed that they said, oh, my parents and my family, they never, my friends, they never liked him, but they couldn't see. I mean, if we never had limerence, people would never get,
Just a definition of limerence, just so we can get clarity on the
yeah.
meaning that we are chemically designed to focus in on the potential father, carer or supporter.
Yeah, so it's that whole that love, what we call falling in love and feeling in love, that first flush, that might last 2 weeks, 6 months, 2 years for people where you're just flooded with all those, desires and focused upon that person. And there's a lot of, hormonal drivers in there. One of those being oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone that is emitted from the top of babies' scalps. So, when you nuzzle up to a little baby, it enhances attachment, right? And it also enhances trust and attachment with the other person.
And care and regard and love and so that's happening in the context.
Yes, but we can't be blinded by those. Yes, we can't be blinded by those things and make financial decisions in that time. Don't do it.
Wake up.
I think when they said you're going to be engaged for a year, they knew that. The forefathers or foreparents, whatever, they knew. Well, settle down. We know the dust is going to settle. And you go, no, we're going to be in love like this forever. That's right. And I think with a lot of, and this is what I talk about in my work as well, with a lot of prevention strategies, and, there is a focus on the gender inequality and all those kinds of things. Absolutely vitally important. But I think you can't throw, that whole influence of love and being in love and expectations around love out of the mix. You can't.
And hormones. Yeah.
You just can't, we know with a lot of things that people, when they make decisions, they don't make, much to the horror of economists, people don't make rational decisions, and it's the same thing. Like, why is she doing that? Or why is he doing that? Yeah, well, their main driver there is to preserve the relationship and maintain that love, and it's just like, and it gets to the point where, well, it was more important for me to, be in that relationship or what have you, than to worry about, the $10 or the $20 that he wanted here or there.
Yeah.
Or, the shoes that she wanted or the handbag or whatever it might be. So it gets
tricky.
It's kind of, it's messy and it's tricky.
Yeah.
Because it's like when you're dealing with friendship groups, right? You just, you lend the friend money, they never pay you back, and you think, okay, not lending that person any more money anymore, and it's, you moderate your relationship or your friendship with them kind of around that, I guess. Similarly, when you go out for dinner and, there might be certain groups of people that you go out with who just spend up big and just go, yeah, we'll split the bill, and you've been,
eating a rice cracker,
watching what you're eating and ordering and not buying bottles of champagne, because you can't afford it. So later on, okay, I'm not going to go out with those group of people, or you're going to be explicit about it before the bill, comes along. But, getting back to your question about socialization effectively is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that, the term that we, call financial socialization. Like, what did you see and hear when you were growing up? How did your parents manage money? What did you learn from your friends or your siblings about, money and those? Did you have conversations about money? Or when you mentioned things about money, the family go, oh, don't talk about that. We don't talk about money, politics or religion, those kinds of things, So that does influence people. But, financial abuse can be, well educated, less educated, wealthy people, less wealthy, people on welfare, and, all cultures basically. But there are, I guess, particular issues to be, or factors to be concerned about, and that is when anything magnifies, I guess, the power differential in a relationship. So it might be income differential, or someone has a disability, so is more dependent on the other person. So anything, or someone is ill, and these can work for or against you. So, for example, I did hear of one case where a young man was supporting his partner who had a mental health issue, and then she was just, when she was manic, just spending all this stuff on his credit card, and he didn't want to put a stop to it because he was concerned for her mental well-being, but he also, got into all this financial difficulty because of it, right? And so, yeah, it can go either way. Where also, again, someone with a disability can, be more easily controlled or manipulated because, there's that dependence. And look, I think it's really hard because
Yeah.
what is a relationship, right? A relationship is a lot of things, but part of it is having someone who's going to have your back, and someone who will support you when you need to be supported, and someone who you can support, if they need to be supported, And so how do you
Yeah. And that's that idea of that community that we're constantly,
yeah,
really, we're longing for that, and so that when money and the behavior of money is not clear and not explicit, then that's the challenging element.
yeah, I think that knowing, I think the question is like, how can you allow someone to care for you without them controlling you, and how can you care for someone without them exploiting you? How do you get that balance right?
Yeah.
I think the other interesting point, I'll just add in that this whole women being very financially independent, coming into a relationship, you're both working, both financially independent, or you go like, oh yeah, I'm earning the same amount as he does, and we're both whatever, semi-professionals, whatever it might be. I mean, there's always going to be income disparity. And then what shocked me to hear was, so in one case where the young woman worked less because she was going to have children, said like, oh well, he earns more, therefore he has more right to make decisions about the money. Now, that's still operating as individuals rather than a collective, but also seeing, as I guess in economic terms, the inputs into that collective only as actual hard cash financial, as opposed to all the other things, right?
So you're saying that the voting rights, let's say, to break it down,
Yeah.
the voting rights in this collective is skewed to the person that brings in more resources.
Yes.
That's the kind of premise that we're building under, of
Yeah.
saying, well, that's great that you've brought that up. I think that's really interesting to see that actually, well, particularly for women, if we look at it as a gender and child rearing, should she have less voting rights because she's the one that's not bringing in the cash, when the value of looking after children is just important? Jessica, I love that you brought that up.
Yeah. But I think part of the thing that drives that is what's happened to us beforehand, is that your value in society is about your capacity to go to work and earn money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore you're bringing money into the household, right? And it's almost like the unintended consequence of valuing
The hunting over the gathering.
yeah, the hunting over the gathering, but then also, now we're also being taught like, yes, I can earn and I can bring money into the household, but when I'm not doing that,
I'm less valuable.
I have no value, right?
Beautiful.
Whereas in maybe in the olden days, where there was no expectation to go out and work, and your value was to look after the household. Now, what I find fascinating, it's only when you get to the family law court that it is in law where it says, doesn't matter how much money you brought in, non-work efforts are as equally as valuable as
Equally valued.
are equally valued. So, they've got that collective sense in the family law court, but where did that disappear in that whole process?
Yeah.
Right? When is it
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
yours and mine?
And that's socialization. That's individual values. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we need to tread gently, gently. I don't think you function now because we're getting married longer, having children later, you're functioning as financial independence longer, right? And then how do you bring that together? I don't think you can do it suddenly, right? I think it's also a gradual coming together of parts
Mm.
and some of those things, but ensuring that, everybody still has, all that communication is there, that open access is there, and those joint goals are there, but also respect for individual goals and needs, but not to the expense of, like we were saying before, the collective.
Yeah. I'm going to play devil's advocate, and this is something that I see a lot with working with my clients, and that is a couple of things that we, in order to, it's quite controversial, is that we somehow use money in the relationship as a way of buying love and loyalty, as a way of building. If I buy love, if I fund this, what's happening in my partner, I can build and maybe buy safety, love, loyalty. Did you come across that idea at all?
Absolutely. And I think that was part of that whole, this is what I'm investing into this relationship.
Mm.
I'm making these investments. It's kind of like what I was saying before, because there's this expectation that it is this kind of collective. You are working together and it'll be reciprocated. But it's also like, I guess you want to be able to meet your partner's needs. So there was one young man whose girlfriend was saying, "Oh, I want you to get me this as a present, and then I want you to get me this as a present," and then the demands just started to get higher and higher, or more expensive. Now in the beginning, thought that was a reasonable, I suppose, cost or need to meet of his girlfriend, but then it became unrealistic, and then he got to the point where he was not having enough money for his own rent. At that point, he had to kind of to stop that. So I think I think it's more subtle as opposed to
Mm.
an explicit thing, but I think that there is that expectation. This is what you do. You buy each other presents and gifts. And, there's a long history and a long culture of, gift giving in societies and, sharing those kind of resources and things like that. I think
That it's not explicit, it is subtle. And so it is very difficult to actually have any hard or fast rules around what's going to happen.
I think so. And the converse of that is like there is also that even now there is also that expectation that that people do express their love through gifts that they might give you,
Mm.
right? And I recall one young woman saying, the whole 3 years together, he never bought me a single present. So it's kind of, and we had to keep splitting the bill every single time. So these kind of things became equated with not being very romantic at all.
Mm.
So quite. Yeah, there's that other extreme. I guess with all those things, there's the extreme where it's kind of like there's a balance with the gift giving. There can be no gifts at all, and that can be seen as negative, or there can be showering with excessive gifts, and then the kind of, oh, well, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of expectations?
Mm.
And then there could be the reverse where you're actually expecting or demanding expensive gifts or dinners and things like that from the other person.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it is tricky, but I think what I found with young people, that it basically, in particular with the ones that I interviewed, got to the point where it's like, well, it's not worth it anymore
Mm.
in those kinds of scenarios. And that
Yeah.
what did become evident was that even though they were thinking that there was this love and loyalty, or this trust, it actually wasn't there. I can't tell you how many times they said to me, oh, the relationship ended because, he went off with somebody, he was having an affair, or he was doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
So
there's something that's kind of rattling around me in this idea, and it's something that we get modeled, but also in our socialization. And again, I work a lot with is about boundaries. What I've seen from study, working with people is that as children, we kind of have our boundaries knocked out of us from our parents in a way that means that because they're there to support us. But we're not really truly taught how to then reinstill that boundary. And I see that often is that an individual in a relationship doesn't know how to build boundaries around basically being in relationship with money. And it's one of the bigger issues that I see, and it's very painful to even own that I didn't have the boundary to put up against that.
So that's really interesting because we've actually had these discussions about, after interviewing people and well, what is going on? Why is it that they think that they can go into a relationship and just keep asking that person for money? Have they just transferred that financial relationship from their parents? Oh, I need $20 to go out. I've run out of money, to their girlfriend or boyfriend. What's happening there? And I think that's part of what we need and what we need to do is, and this covers kind of the areas of not only teaching young people about respectful relationships, throughout primary school and secondary schools, but also teaching them financial skills throughout primary and secondary school. But when teaching those financial skills, you also need to teach, okay, what does that mean when you're in a relationship?
Yeah.
What I like to call relationship-based financial capabilities, right? How are you going to manage that in a relationship? And so that needs to happen because if it's not happening at home, then at least you can hear or learn about those things. That's why schools teach sex education and drug and alcohol information, just to make sure that they're getting, the most up-to-date, comprehensive information around those topics, whether the parents have spoken about it or not. Certainly I don't think my mother ever was taught those things when she was growing up.
No, and it works both ways, how other people cross boundaries as well as other people not putting boundaries up.
Yes.
Boundaries is a piece that has two parties basically, and we're not often taught how to be good with boundaries because it's very linked in. Well, if I have my boundaries down, then maybe you'll love me more. But actually, when we build up our boundaries, we become a bit more lovable because we know what's there to love.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's really interesting because it's like, you say those boundaries, and I think like, yeah, you got to have emotional, and we always talk about, being emotionally open with the other person and open and honest and breaking down those barriers or boundaries that we might have so we can have that emotional connection. But it is also about, what are your financial boundaries and being aware of those? What's appropriate, what's not appropriate in those contexts?
Yeah.
Because indeed, when you start with a particular way of doing things or a habit or whatever, or a process or a way of doing things in a relationship, it's very hard to break out of those things, because there'll be that pushback, right?
Yeah.
And so it's either being aware of, oh, hang on, this is a bit of a pattern, which isn't great, and getting on top of that, or knowing what those potential patterns might be in the beginning, without getting too entwined where it becomes way too complicated to kind of set those boundaries. Because it's very hard to set a boundary once after the
to pull a boundary up if it wasn't there. Exactly. Yeah. It's one of the big things that people want to be enabled around is their financial boundaries, and we don't do enough teaching of it, how it got run over, how I didn't even have it. Not even something that I considered for myself, or that, I don't even see that I'm doing it to another. It's a big piece that we don't do enough about understanding financial boundaries. And also I was just going to say, and also too, because if we look at it macrocosmically too, we get, oh no, I'm not going to go there actually. I was going to go into the bank story, but
Yeah, well, they got no boundaries either.
Mm.
And, to some extent, when you
Micro situations where we're doing it in a relationship, but we also see it very macro cosmically where we are institutions, banks are also running over boundaries as well, running over boundaries on environment, on ethics, on everything. So it's a bigger conversation. We don't even have a concept of financial boundaries.
I think there's a human propensity to take the shortcut, right? If you can take the shortcut, you'll go there. And I remember when they first built, not that old, but when they first built Monash Uni, and I said, why are the lawns in between the buildings like mini hills, like big mounds, right? And they said, well, they figured out that when it was flat, people would just cut across it to get to where they needed to go. They would take the shortcut. And of course, it'd get ugly because it'd be worn out paths. But of course, when it became a hill and there was a bit more effort to get to the other side, they went around. And it solved that problem. So people always want to take the easy way. Organizations always want to take the easy way. Why should organizations have environmentally friendly packaging when they're not required to by law? Why can't banks and car yards get everybody a loan when they can, when it fits within some version of the law? And then it's also, even now with this whole,
softening of the lending rights. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. So that's tightened up a bit at least. But even now with, I guess, COVID, and they wanting to stimulate the economy, they want people to spend, right? We'll give you extra money, you go out and spend it. Now, what we've been saying in financial capability, financial education is you need to save so that you're prepared for the rainy period.
Exactly.
And guess what happened? COVID was the rainy period. Was the rainy day.
Yeah.
And now, instead of saying like, hello, population, we all experience the rainy day. Make sure you save so that you've got a buffer for your business. You've got a buffer for your mortgage. You've got a buffer for your rent. You're not living paycheck to paycheck. Really hard to do.
Yeah.
But no, it's like, go out and spend your money so we can recover. And it's just like,
yeah, confusing. Absolutely confusing.
But it is. It is absolutely right. So there is this pressure to be boundaryless. It's like, oh, you don't have a credit card, you can use a shop-based, without naming anyone, pay service or whatever, post-purchase payment plan.
Yeah, regardless of your current financial situation, regardless of your debt risk, regardless of your mental health, we're going to boundaryless give you as much money as you so choose. Yeah, yeah.
So why when somebody asks you, do this for me, or why won't you do this for me? You think like, oh well, every other message that I'm getting is, yeah, do it.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you do it? It's very hard to push back on those forces. So I guess that's part of what in the work that we've been doing and setting up this toolkit is about, how do you have these conversations? What conversations do you need to have? And it might not be so cool to have them very early on, but you need to figure out where your money values lie, in the same way you want to explore where people's relationship values lie. So like, we're a couple, so we're exclusive now. Okay, all right then. Okay, let's also have a conversation about the money stuff as well, and what those boundaries might be.
Yeah. So what's the sort of support people can get out there, if they feel that they're experiencing financial abuse?
So there are a lot of support services that people can access. And I think what's important for young adults and everybody is that those support services are there for everybody, regardless of your age, your gender, your orientation, your culture, So that's really important to know. I kind of found with the young people that I interviewed, unless they had a previous history, so mental health issues or abuse they weren't connected to services, because they didn't see those services as something that was for them. It was because they didn't see what they were experiencing was financial abuse or, a relationship abuse. So they just saw that all those things were for other people, and in particular for people who are experiencing physical violence. That is not the case, right? So all the services are there for people, whether they're experiencing physical abuse or not. I mean, economic abuse can be a condition of a intervention order. You don't need to have just physical abuse to get an intervention order out against somebody, for example. It is listed in there in the legislation as part of, domestic and family violence.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I guess the most important thing is that if somebody thinks this is something that might be happening in their relationship or to them or to somebody that they know, is to actually just speak to somebody else about it, someone that they can trust. And these services and helplines are a good place to start, such as 1-800-RESPECT, right? It's for everybody. It's not gender-based. And the most important thing is to develop a kind of a safe plan to exit or to leave the relationship.
Yeah.
And indeed, a worker will help you figure out how, whether there's physical risk and how you can best start the process of untangling yourself economically from that person. And that is the thing. It's the major reason why people stay in abusive relationships is because of they can't see a financial way out of there. Where am I going to live? How am I going to support myself? How am I going to support myself and my family? Things like that. There are support services and things like that out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think too what's important is that people need to also be aware of, their legal and consumer rights. So Consumer Action Law Centre and those kinds of resources are also really helpful. And people can get access to free financial counselling to find out what they can do by, accessing the National Debt Helpline, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And that's really important, especially if, for example, somebody's misused your credit card or racked up fines in your name, or, you need to get some help and advice of how to resolve the debt that is in your name but is for something that the other person has,
Yeah, yeah. So there's very free and available resources for everybody.
Lots.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess the first step for people is actually recognising that what they're experiencing is financial. It's just not fair.
Yeah.
It's financial abuse and something needs to be done about it.
Yeah.
And I think with young people in particular, like when I did my research, they just went like, oh, I saw the ad and I thought, oh, actually that's happened to me. So, that is that first step of raising that awareness of recognising, this isn't right. It's like what you were saying. The boundaries have been crossed, the lines have been crossed.
Yeah.
This shouldn't be your burden to carry, or this shouldn't be happening to you.
Yeah. Reading your research, I was like, I've been through this. And I've never really identified it in myself that I've been in a relationship where I've experienced financial abuse. So, yeah, anyone.
It's very common, and I often forget when I'm talking about it that there will be people listening or people in the audience who've had these experiences and all might be realising for the first time, oh, that's what happened to me. Oh,
yeah,
actually, that's happening to my sister, or that's happening to my brother, or...
Yeah. And it's that quality of seeing how it's the fairness for the collective, equal vote, equal rights, equal, yeah. So, look, something that, has been so amazing in my journey of working with people, particularly around their financial situation, is knowing that when we share our own story around money, how liberating that can be. So I always like to ask my speakers, what was money like for you when you were growing up?
Fantastic question. And I was first asked this question by a reporter from The Age, and I went like, ooh, okay. Actually, it was horrible, to put it bluntly. My father, who's no longer alive, so he was actually a very controlling, patriarchal person, and really controlled all the finances in the family to the point where, my mother, she got an allowance. And if there was an extra expense, such as someone's birthday coming up, or, we might have needed new clothes or something like that, she would have to beg him for that money. And in fact, it was like that every week when it came time for her to get her housekeeping, right? Where he would then rant and rave and, walk through the kitchen. And I remember it like it was yesterday, slide his finger across the top of the fridge and say things like, "Why should I give you your money? What have you been doing all day? Look at all the dust on the top of the fridge," And for me, growing up in that environment was, I learned very quickly that if I borrowed money from him and it was borrowed, that I was going to that I would pay it back straight away. Otherwise, he would torture you about it. It's like, well, I gave you that money, blah, blah, blah. And why haven't you paid me back? And, why would you want to subject yourself to that? So, and then I also became myself, and I think I still have that, although, I don't like to spend money on clothes and things. I might spend it on other things like practical things, but I find it really hard to spend money on clothes. And, it was like, well, actually, you only have 3 pairs of shoes. It's okay if you buy another pair of shoes, And the other thing that I remember learning growing up in that environment was kind of like that reverse deception that people need to use in these situations to cope with the situation. And it's called, acts of resistance. And they talk about this in the domestic violence literature of ways that women cope with the situation. And all right, I think, I was maybe a bit cleverer than my dad, but I knew that, for example, I remember, I don't know if you recall, the jeans with the pockets down the side. It's all the rage, and they were all in pastel colours and things like that. And I wanted a new pair of those. And I knew that I think they were $15. But I knew that if I'd asked him for money for those, he would bargain me down, right? So I knew if I started at $25, he would maybe give me $15. And I was right. So that's what I would do. He would say, "How much are they?" I said, "Oh, they're $25. Here, you can have this much." So it was constantly about this power. I remember the day I got my first job working at a delicatessen at a nearby plaza. And I was so excited. And I told him. And I to this day, I can see the devastation on his face. And I sat there and I thought, yes, you're devastated because now you don't have any control over me anymore, And, it was only until I didn't start working in this area because I thought about this, right? I started getting, Rosalind Russell, who I worked with, needed help on a survey. I was working in drug and alcohol. And I said, and a colleague said, "Oh, I know someone needs help on a survey." And it was about women and money. And I thought, like, yeah, sure, I'll help on the survey. So next thing you know, I'm working there as well. And then it's like, oh, all these women are having, have got secret bank accounts, 23%. And she was involved in these projects with Wire, who were investigating, financial abuse amongst women. And then it became a question of like, nobody knows what the prevalence is. And I went like, oh, there must be a survey or some data out there. Let's go and, figure that out. And, so I never thought of myself as someone who grew up in that kind of environment. And, now it's a whole area of discussion and research of, children exposed to, family violence and things. I would never thought I was someone like that. But, I can really see it all now. But it's still really hard to talk.
Yeah, so just on that, what's the impact, do you think, that's made on you about you and money?
Oh, I think I've found that, that whole, for me, I think I still find having those money conversations with someone as really difficult. And I guess I was lucky with my ex that he was really quite open about it,
Mm.
and it was quite easy. And where I was kind of a bit more concerned and reluctant, and he just went like, no, of course we'll do this. He had that collective thing, whereas I kind of like had that more like, oh, but that's my
Mm.
ex-dad or whatever it was, no, I need to pay that off myself. And,
Mm.
so it does make that difficult or tricky. And look, the other aspect that it has, impact that it has for me, and this is I suppose the case with most people, is that you have a different approach with your own children.
Mm.
So I've been very proactive in trying to, teach them about, saving their money, having savings goals, and learning those kind of financial independence skills. But also I'm trying to negotiate and understand, well, what do you do when you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or you have a fight with your siblings when you bought, something, and then someone came along and ate it all, and, how are you going to resolve all of that?
Mm.
So,
Yeah. So the other thing I was really keen to kind of find out, and, because we often don't get enough guidance or kind of guidance on how we're supposed to be with money, and more particularly how I'm supposed to be, my personality, my, worldview and all that. So what was it in an ideal world you would have loved to have been taught? It doesn't matter that you didn't get it, just what would you have loved to have known about money that could have maybe helped you a bit better?
yeah, that it's not a thing that represents power and control and evil, that it's not a tool for manipulation,
Mm.
because it is a very powerful tool for that. Like, you can completely and utterly, what do you call it? Not sabotage, but
Weaponize, I call it.
yeah, that's what I will like. If, almost like a freezing gun. It's like
Mm.
you can just freeze a person,
Mm.
into a situation when, they can try and do a whole lot of other things. But yeah, so I think that just how it can be more open and shared, and that kind of collective understanding, that collective notion, and that your value. And look, I have to feel sorry for him as well, because, in a way, perhaps that's all what he thought what his role was in his life, was to work hard and bring, we always had everything. We were never homeless. We went,
Mm.
on little holidays and things like that. And that those would have been his markers of success, right? But the way he did it was just really bad,
Mm.
and that wasn't necessary,
Mm.
because you could achieve all those same goals without doing it in that controlling way.
Mm.
And then I often think, like, hang on, but because I think about, oh, well, maybe it's his cultural background or his upbringing, or because he migrated on his own, like escaped communist Yugoslavia, and came out here, built everything up himself, and maybe he felt he had to constantly protect that which he had strived to create. But you can still do all those things without being horrible.
Mm.
Like, there's nothing to say to kids like, oh, well, $25 is a lot for a pair of jeans. Like, look at different ways, or how can you save, or what can we do differently to
Mm.
meet those needs. It's really hard. And I think,
Beautiful.
yeah, it's funny how you end up in these areas of research, Like, the first area of research I worked in was asthma epidemiology. And I remember working with people from the Asthma Foundation. And I remember my boss then saying to me, I said, oh, it's an interesting person. Oh, yes, one of these people who, trying to heal themselves by working in that area, because that person was a very severe asthma sufferer. Well, I never went into it, consciously like that. But obviously, the kind of the dynamics and the fascination with money
Mm.
steers you that way, because it has been not an insignificant component of your life in a way.
Mm.
And look, it's like what I said, money is a part of everyone's life, and it's you can't just get rid of it, like physical abuse or,
Yeah.
emotional abuse and things. You can't get rid of it. You have to deal with it. It's going to be there. You can't avoid it, right? So putting your head in the sand helps nobody, right? And unfortunately, as uncomfortable, as awkward, and as, like, unromantic it might be,
Mm.
you need to deal with it, because it's one of the major reasons why people break up. conflict around money.
Yeah. Jessica, thank you so much for being with us. It's been an absolutely amazing conversation. You are just love your research and love the work that you're doing. So thank you for being here on the Financial Therapy Podcast.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you so much for taking the time to investigate this issue further.
Please refer to the show notes about domestic violence hotlines around the world. Plus, I really would love for you to rate and review this program, and for more resources about how to get you being better with money, please go to financialtherapy.org.